And now I can see Peter Tatchell in the room. Welcome, Peter. And it's your turn now. Just before I hand over the mic to you, I'd like just to introduce Peter. Peter is the director of the Peter Tatchell Foundation. He's a well-known human rights campaigner, and he's best known for his work with LGBT social movements. And so without further ado, we are really delighted to have Peter with us today. And the mic's yours, Peter. Thanks very much. I think you're mute, Peter.
Thank you very much. My apologies that I was not able to join you earlier, but I had previous engagements, and at about 8 o'clock or just before, I need to go to another engagement. But it is a great honor to join you. And I want to start by expressing my solidarity with political prisoners in Iran and their loved ones and families, their supporters, and of course, all of you who are campaigning for a free and democratic Iran. Your struggle under conditions of great adversity is so admirable. I'm so inspired by your courage, your determination, despite the odds being stacked against you. We know that sometimes campaigning does work. Sometimes people due to be executed, their lives are saved. Sometimes people who are being tortured, the torture is stopped. Sometimes political prisoners who are... So a huge, huge appreciation and admiration for all of you who are working to support political prisoners in Iran. I want to say that I'm sure many issues will have been covered by other speakers, but I'd like to focus on what can be done. And one of the most important initial things, of course, is to raise public and international awareness, which is what this event is seeking to do. So many people around the world are unaware of the extreme oppression of the Iranian regime. They see, a quite modern society, a quite well-educated society. They see the PR efforts of the Iranian regime. Many do not realize the scale of internal repression and the extreme brutality of the penal system, whereby fair trials are almost unheard of for political prisoners, where many confessions are extracted under torture, and where people are hanged because of state manufactured evidence or false confessions. So raising awareness is the #1 priority. And it pains me greatly that many on the liberal and left progressive spectrum of opinion in the West do so little to support our comrades in Iran. Of course, the left and liberal progressive opinion will rally to many causes, but there seems to be a singular lack of serious solidarity by Western left liberal and progressive people. I can remember, I think it was, 20 years ago, or maybe a bit less, in one single night, 800 trade unionists, mostly members of the bus workers union in Tehran, 800 trade unionists were arrested on a single night in Tehran. There were almost no trade unions in the West who rallied to protest and support those jailed trade unionists. When the trials came up, again, there was almost no support from Western trade unions or liberal progressive organizations. And it pains me as someone on the left to say this, because the left should be in solidarity with workers and Democrats and liberals and progressive people right across the globe. There should be no borders when it comes to international solidarity. So that's another strand that we have to build, as well as building public awareness about the scale of repression in Iran. we also need to build solidarity movements, which will support trade unions and workers who are being victimized by the regime, students and other activists, oppositionists, critics, dissidents who are being jailed and tortured, women's rights campaigners. Again, it's so shocking to me to think that, you know, on International Women's Day, a group of women gather in Tehran in so-called Justice Square to protest for women's rights. They're beaten and arrested by the police, and Western feminists, for the most part, do nothing, say nothing, completely ignore the heroic struggle of those women. And of course, we know in more recent years, the way in which so many Iranian women have thrown off the hijab, refused to abide by the compulsory requirement that they wear the hijab. And many of them have been sentenced to long terms of imprisonment. But again, Western left and feminist movements have been, for the most part, not entirely, but for the most part, singularly failing in showing solidarity with those brave, heroic women. The same goes to trade unionists and workers, the sugar workers, the bus workers, many of the bakers' workers, leaders in prison, denied medical treatment, you know, simply for trying to organize to defend their rights, to protest against the non-payment of wages, to protest against unsatisfactory health and safety in the workplace, to protest against being forced to work long hours. These should be acts of automatic solidarity by Western progressive movements. Likewise, when it comes to human rights defenders and others who are seeking to shine a light on the injustices, when they are imprisoned, yes, there are some campaigns to support them, but not nearly enough. And I just find it so strange. When Israel does a single bad thing, the whole Western left, progressive left, will protest, and quite rightly. But when Iran does things many times worse, there's almost universal silence. And this is no more acute when it comes to the rights of the Awazi Arab people in southwest Iran. These are Arabs, kindred spirits of Palestinian Arabs. Israel, I've got many criticisms of the way Israel treats its Arab population, both inside Israel, in the occupied territories, and the whole setup in the Middle East. But it is nothing by comparison to what Iran does to its own Arab population. They are banned from forming their own political parties. They're banned from having newspapers in their own Arab language. They are banned from teaching Arabic in schools. Cultural workers, those promoting Arab culture, poetry, literature, and art, are regularly arrested on trumped up charges. Now, Israel may do many bad things, but nothing like this. Yet the Western left is so silent about what are far more extreme actions against Arab people by the Iranian regime. It is frankly hypocrisy. It is double standards. And I feel so ashamed to be someone on the left, to see the way in which the left refuses to show Iranian Arabs the same solidarity they show Palestinian Arabs. And of course, it's not just the Arab minority, it's the Baluch minority, the Turkoman, the Kurdish, the Azeri, all the other minority nationalities within Iran are also treated very, very badly. Similar cultural, economic, and political repression. So this really is a huge challenge for all of us in the international community. What can we do to support these many disparate struggles in Iran? I haven't mentioned, of course, LGBT plus people in Iran, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Iranians, who also are victimized and face the death penalty for same-sex relations in Iran. You know, again, this is an issue which far too far too few people on the progressive left of Western opinion have rallied to support. I want to say that many of us will be familiar with the policy of boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions as it was applied to apartheid South Africa and as it is applied by many against Israel today. But why is there no comparable boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions campaign against Iran? Iran ranks with apartheid South Africa and Israel in terms of the way it abuses and oppresses its citizens and those under its occupation. I've got to say that, we know that boycott, sanctions, and disinvestment do work. They are non-violent, they are peaceful, but they do work. And I would say that we need to explore more avenues and opportunities to apply BDS against the Iranian regime, while at the same time being very careful that we avoid penalizing, punishing, and causing harm to ordinary Iranians. The people of Iran are not our enemy. It is the regime, and they are the ones that need to be targeted. So I would like to suggest that we need to draw up a proper program for boycott, sanctions, and disinvestment in Iran. Now, of course, there's not much investment going on, but if the nuclear deal is fixed, there will be a rush to investment. And we know that many Western companies are lining up to invest in Iran in the hope that there will be a resolution to the nuclear issue. We need to make sure that these Western corporations are held to account. They must not invest in a country where the regime is abusing its people. Two other things I'd like to suggest. One is using international law. The case in Sweden is a classic example of the use of international law as it can be applied against the Iranian regime. So we have the International United Nations Convention Against Torture 1984, which has been signed by over 130 or 140 countries now. It allows for the prosecution of any state official anywhere in the world who commits, condones, authorizes, or acquiesces in acts of torture. And that is the basis on which the case in Sweden is now proceeding. But I would like to see similar cases proceeded, not just in Sweden, but in many other countries as well. There's a clear international legal mandate to do so. And I'm not suggesting that it alone can change things. But if people in Iran think that one day they may be hauled before an international court and be imprisoned for a very long time, it may act as some deterrent against some of the worst excesses of the regime. The other issue I'd like to raise is the question that there is nothing to stop any country from issuing international arrest warrants against leaders of the Iranian political and military and indeed religious regime for human rights abuses. Again, the issue would be when and how to execute that warrant. That would be very difficult unless those people traveled overseas to a Western country, or indeed any country, which had issued an arrest warrant. But again, it acts as a powerful deterrent. It restricts their freedom of movement. It makes life more difficult. And finally, I'd suggest that it'd be worthwhile exploring use of the American Alien Tort Act. Under this act, a number of international human rights abusers have been prosecuted, or legal actions have been brought against them, using this very ancient bit of American law dating back, I think, nearly 200 years. But it does give a legal basis for action in the American courts, in the US courts, against human rights abusers. So those are a number of issues and ideas that I would suggest that are worth exploring. we know that there is no guarantee that any of them will work, but we know from past experience with other countries, some of them sometimes can work. And the more pressure we can heap upon the Iranian regime, the better. The more likely that they will perhaps be deterred from some of their worst excesses. I'm not expecting them to become angels overnight, no way, but maybe some of the worst excesses of the regime will be held in check. So I'm going to finish there, and if anybody wants to ask any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. But once again, huge solidarity with you, with all of you who are struggling for democracy, freedom, and human rights in Iran. You are inspirational. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks so much for that, Peter Tatchell. Really brilliant. And just for the benefit of our Farsi-speaking speakers, audience, I will just go through the main points that you raised. It'll have to be in Farsi. من چند نکته از نکات کلیدی صحبت‌های پیتر تچل رو براتون اینجا میخونم. پیتر گفت که متاسفه که نتونست سر وقت بیاد و چون یک برنامه دیگه بود و ساعت فقط 8 اروپا میتونست بیاد تو برنامه، ولی البته اینو از قبل گفته بودن، مسئله نبود، و گفته که من میخوام همبستگیمو با شما ابراز بکنم و نشون داده به کمپین ها، کاری که شما دارین میکنین مثل این کارهای کمپینی موثرن، میتونن زندانیان سیاسی رو نجات بدن، میتونن جلوی شکنجه رو بگیرن. و در این حال به چند نکته خواسته اشاره بکنه. گفت یک نکته مهم توجه افکار عمومی رو جلب کردن به شرایط وضعیت مردم در ایرانه، شدت و وسعت سرکوب در ایران که خیلی ها مطلع نیستن و قوانین هاری که در ایران حاکمه، شکنجه، اعدام و اینکه امنیتی میکنن، پاپوش درست میکنن بدون هیچ مدرکی برای افراد و زندانی میکنن اینا رو. و در این حال خواست اشاره بکنه به عکس‌العمل گروه‌های لیبرال و چپ و بخش مترقی جامعه در غرب که به ویژه تو انگلیس که به نظرش ممکنه اونا کارهای خوبی در یه موارد دیگه میکنن، ولی در این مورد، در مورد جنایاتی که جمهوری اسلامی میکنه به نحو عجیبی اینا ساکت هستند. و اشاره کرد پیتر تچل به اعتصاب کارگران شرکت واحد و گفت که حدود 800 کارگر اون موقع تو اون اعتصاب بزرگ دستگیر شدن، ولی حمایت قابل توجهی از طرف اون به اصطلاح بخش مترقی جامعه نبود. البته من خودم اشاره بکنم که اتحادیه‌های کارگری، چند اتحادیه کارگری فعال شدن در این زمینه، ولی به طور عمومی نکته پیتر تچل اینه که از اون بخش به اصطلاح لیبرال و به اصطلاح چپ جامعه. و میگفت در روز جهانی زن شما میبینید که زنان شجاعی در ایران بلند میشن، حجابا رو دور میندازن، سرود میخونن و اعتراض میکنن به علیه حجاب. و در این حال شما نمیبینی که حمایت خیلی وسیع از طرف یا مطلقاً از طرف فمینیستای رسمی توی غرب صورت بگیره. در اکثر موارد گفتن اینطوری، ممکنه بعضیا بکنه ولی خیلی کمه و این میگه که خیلی مایه تاسفه. در این حال میگه که وقتی که مثلا دولت اسرائیل که کاری میکنه اینا خیلی راحت میان محکوم میکنن، که میگه درسته در موارد زیادی باید محکوم کرد، ولی در جنایات خیلی وحشتناکتر که تو ایران تحت حاکمیت جمهوری اسلامی صورت میگیره میبینی که بخشی از این بخش پروگرسیو یا مترقی جامعه ساکته. و مثال میزنن در این حال وضعیت مردم در خوزستان و اعتراضاتی که شد، مردم عرب که که از خیلی از خواستای خود محروم هستند و همینطور در مورد مردم بلوچ و در مورد آذری ها. و میگفت که عکس‌العمل و حمایتی رو کم میبینیم از طرف این بخشی از جامعه. به هر حال میگفت که یک چالش بزرگیه، ما باید یک کاری بکنیم که چه کار میتونیم بکنیم. و در مورد دگرباشان جنسیتی و LGBT ها هم اشاره کرد که مثلا زمینه فعالیت خیلی اصلی پیتر تاچل و گفتن که در این مورد هم که تو ایران جمهوری اسلامی اعدام میکنه کسی رو به خاطر این که یه بخش متعلق به بخش LGBT جامعه است و میبینیم که در این مورد هم باید اون اعتراضی که در سطح جهانی با صورت بگیره نمیشه و به طور مشخص چند تا چیز رو اشاره میکنه پیتر تاتچل. یکی بایکوت جمهوری اسلامیه. من اشاره بکنم که پیتر تاتچل از خودش از اون یکی از امضا کنندگان کمپین برای بایکوت جمهوری اسلامیه، کمپینی که مدافعین زیادی داره و میگه که مایه تعجبه که وقتی که تو اواخر دهه 80 دولت نجات پرست آفریقای جنوبی از طرف جهان مورد بایکوت و طرد و انزوا قرار گرفت، این همین در مورد جمهوری اسلامی اتفاق نمیفته. میگه که این زمینه‌ای که ما براش باید کار بکنیم و این خیلی میتونه موثر باشه. در این حال به دو مورد دیگه هم اشاره میکنه برای محاکمه سران جمهوری اسلامی، مثل موردی که الان در سوئد در جریان حمید نوری که من اضافه بکنم معذورشونه و به عنوان به خاطر جنایت علیه بشریت و به خاطر شکنجه و میگه از قوانینی که همین الان موجوده میشه استفاده کرد، مثل قانون علیه شکنجه Convention Against Torture و همینطور قوانینی که توی آمریکا هست مثل مانند Alien Tort Act، قانون Alien Tort که بر اساس اون جرایم بین‌المللی رو میشه به دادگاه کشوند. به هر حال اینا نکات اصلی صحبت‌های پیتر تاتچل بود که ما ازش تشکر می‌کنیم به خاطر شرکت در این برنامه